Right, well, it started to slow down, so we'll proceed with the next part of the conference. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Rhiannon. I'm one of the Heritage Volunteering Group steering group members, and I will be chairing this panel discussion. So welcome back if you've just joined us. At the next part of the conference, we are going to hear from some fantastic speakers. We have a panel discussion. So as you've already heard this morning, we are focusing on reimagining for day 2 of the conference today. So we're going to focus on some of the questions that you've sent through around that theme. How we do things differently, what we have learned to inform how we move forward. So I'm joined by 4 wonderful panelists that you can see on your screen ahead of you. So thank you, all 4 of you, for joining us. We have Annie Bethel, who's the Volunteering Participation Manager at English Heritage. We have Ben Marsh, Volunteer Coordinator at Barnsley Museums. We have Rob Jackson, Director of Rob Jackson Consulting Limited. And we have Rosie Wylie, Community Engagement Manager at Historic Environment Scotland. Thank you all for joining me. It's lovely to see you all. So we've had many brilliant questions submitted to us in advance for this panel discussion, and we're just going to pick a few of those to test our panelists today. For our panelists, I'm going to direct some of the questions at individuals, but please do jump in if you've got something to add. We'd really love to hear from you. So give me a wave and we can make sure that we come to you as well. So to kick us off, I'm a big believer in thinking that it's quite hard to really reimagine without also first reflecting. So I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of reflecting for me to start with about your professional reflections. So not personal ones. You might have decided to take up scuba diving, but actually we want to hear from you professionally. So I want to hear from you what the most important thing you have learned professionally over the last year is, and one thing that you will therefore do differently within your working environment as a result. Okay, I am putting them on the spot, so they're having to think. We'll go to Annie first. Annie, are you happy to come in on that one first?
Thought you might come to me first, Rhiannon. Thanks, Liv. So what is the most important thing that I've learned professionally over the past year? I think the most important thing actually is that you can plan and plan and plan and plan, but actually there's always going to be something that is going to throw something in the spokes of your wheels to stop those plans going forwards, and actually being quite quick to change and to change direction can be really important at times, but the most important part of that is bringing people with you, and particularly when a lot of those people aren't necessarily around when you change your mind or change how you approach something. So thinking about people on furlough or volunteers that weren't available at the times when we had to make some really fast decisions has been quite eye-opening, actually, particularly for a big organisation like English Heritage, who are we're quite slow to change and slow to think about things, and actually we can be really responsive when we put our minds to it and when we need to. So what will I do differently? I think that being prepared for anything is probably the easiest thing to say, probably the least easy thing to do, but the easiest thing to say. So just making sure that we do plan, but also plan for change as well.
Amazing. And Annie, you've predicted a lot of the questions are around sort of change management, so we'll pick up on that theme a little bit later, so I may come back to you on that one. Ben, what about you professionally?
Professionally, I suppose that sounds really cliche, but it is that remembering that you are always learning and that there are always things that will come up, and particularly this for me was around equality, diversity and inclusion, which is no surprise to anyone in HVG. But admitting and realizing to myself that there will always be gaps in knowledge, and that's okay because you're always on that learning journey all the time. And if I were to make, if I was to do something differently, I guess I'd have liked myself to come to that realization a bit earlier in my professional career. And yeah, it's okay to get it wrong, but it's not okay to ignore that. You've got to pick it up, go with it, and figure out the next step forward and learn from that. So yeah, always learning, and that's okay.
Brilliant, Ben, and that was absolutely my thinking with asking for your reflections. It's really important that we always reflect, isn't it? We're all human, we will all make mistakes, but if we don't learn from them, there's no gain. Absolutely. Rob, and anyone will tell that I'm going alphabetically at the moment, so it's no surprise, is it, Rob?
So what have I learned? I have learned how much I enjoy being with other people and how much I've missed it. And what am I going to do differently? Make sure I seize every opportunity to be with other people as quickly as possible and it's safe as possible to do so. The other thing I think as well, which picks up a little bit on what Annie said at the start, is I think it's really important that we reflect how much change and innovation leaders of volunteer engagement can do when necessity presents itself as a driver for that. Because I think we can, if we're all honest with ourselves, we can sometimes kind of sit back and say we can't really change anything, nothing changes, we don't have the authority. And actually every single person who's at this conference today has made massive change for the benefit of their volunteers over the course of the last year, in a way that if you'd have asked them if they were going to make that at the end of 2019, they would have laughed in your face. So I think that's a huge thing that, you know, we can be that change, and we need to carry that forward into the future.
Brilliant. We'll be coming back to that as well. And last but not least, Rosie.
Hi everybody. So for me, it's really about reflecting on how much can be achieved by working together. So, you know, we all talked about collaboration, partnerships, etc. But last year, really, you know, a lot of work internally within organisations stopped, paused, got put on hold, and we very quickly pivoted to what can we do in the sector, but also looking at cross sectors. So for us, not just in the heritage sector, but what is the contribution of historic environment to other sectors and recovery and renewal. And so a lot has been achieved in terms of thinking about next year as we head into this landscape. So, and also not trying to plan too much for how a collaboration should go until you're actually in that collaboration has been quite a key point.
Absolutely. It's the last year's proven that we can work a little bit more organically and responsively than we ever thought we could. So we should all give ourselves a huge tap on the back for that resilience as well. And I really like your point as well, Rob, about thinking about our own well-being through this as well. And I hope that will come out throughout this as well, that whilst our roles is quite often to support others within our organisations, we also need to be mindful of ourselves throughout all of this as well. So moving on then, I think we've talked a lot about change and we will come back to that, but I'd like to start hopefully with a slightly more optimistic tone and thinking about moving forward. So I'm going to come to you, Rob. We've had a wide question, but do you think there is renewed optimism for volunteering at this point after the year we've had? And then I'll see if anyone else got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there is. I think there's renewed optimism from government, which is always a bit of a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. And when I say government, I don't just mean Westminster, I mean the 4 governments across the UK as well. I think if you look at what NCVO have recently launched, and there's more work happening and more workshops happening over the summer around a new vision for volunteering in England anyway, I think that's a really exciting opportunity to put volunteering front and centre. So I think all of those are positive and optimistic. My slight hint of caution is, because there's always got to be a slight hint of caution in there, is not just the extent to which that's maintained, but the extent to which it actually has impact. Because there was a lot of that enthusiasm after that small sporting event in East London in 2012, and it didn't really translate into any difference. So I think the optimism is a good thing. The challenge is, how do we make sure that translates into something tangibly different that actually benefits volunteering, volunteer managers, and those people volunteers serve both within the heritage sector and outside into the future.
Lovely, thanks, Rob. And actually, Matt has popped it in, a link into the chat as well to pick up on that point that Rob was making, if anyone wants to follow that. Does any of the other panelists have any sort of reflections on that idea of optimism, and how much is going to change, and are we going to revert back to the norm? Rosie?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with everything that Rob has said there. In terms of government support during the back end of 2020 and into 2021, in Scotland we had the Volunteering for All framework, and now there is a cross-sectoral group in terms of developing an action plan. And the key points for that is about taking it forward again, all volunteer managers working together, and that's been driven by Volunteer Scotland and using human learning systems in terms of that, so trying to simplify the very complex system of government. And the key points in that, lifelong engagement, policy impact, recognition, celebration, and community development. And so that is trying to align everybody together under that action plan for actual tangible outcomes of taking that out into organisations, into the communities, thinking about the human learning systems within that. So I think that that's, again, is a really clear baseline of, I mean, I agree that I do think that, there is a refreshed and new respect for volunteering, community cohesion, and the need for equity, absolutely. And that's been recognised in Scotland. And yeah, lots of other opportunities coming up. COP26, for example, we want to do something. We're going to work in partnership with HVG in terms of looking at sustainable volunteering, bid for the World Volunteering Conference to come to Glasgow. We've got the Make Your Mark Volunteer Participation campaign that we're working with HVG on. Relaunch of the Investing in Volunteers, all the UK nations, coming together with the pipeline, the quality work. So yeah, I absolutely think that there is, the silver linings of that renewed interest. And to go back to my earlier point about the collaboration, is let's all keep moving forward with that, with all these opportunities. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Rosie. And again, Matt and Rob have popped those links in the chat for you that Rosie was referring to. And I think that's a really positive place to start, that yes, there may be a few things that revert back, but actually the general trend is moving forward. And let's, I guess, take that point from Rob's initial statement about we are the ones with the power to ensure that that does happen as well. Brilliant. We've got lots of sort of quite practical questions that we're going to move on to as well, but please do always be thinking about sort of where we're going in the future. And coming back to this point about sort of change, it's great that we're sort of heading towards all of these sort of positive elements that you mentioned, Rosie, but change is challenging. Change is hard for people, for us, for the people that we work with. Annie, I just wondered if you had any advice for delegates on how we could support their volunteering teams through the changes that have happened and are continuing to happen, but also about how we can bring those people positively on that journey with us. And then I'll come to the floor and see if anyone else has got any tips.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's the old thing, isn't it, that without good communication and without good consultation, we're never going to go anywhere. And making sure that those channels are open and good conversations are happening is absolutely vital. And more than ever, I think that we are seeing that we can collaborate better because it's easier for us to access each other. But it's also easier for us to access each other. So there's quite a lot of stuff there to become overwhelmed with through that change as well. So I think there's a word of caution in that as well. I think that overall, when we're looking at any sort of change, understanding the psyche of how people go through change is really important, and getting your head around how the change curve happens and how people react to that sort of thing, and being able to recognise where people are within that process is incredibly important as well, and how that might how their reaction will change over time to any sort of change that you're implementing as well. But I think the really vital thing is that we learn from what we've we've found. We see what was the good stuff and what was the not so good stuff, and try and bin the not so good stuff, but learn why it wasn't so good, so that we can move forward in a positive type of way. And I think overall there's probably a lot of people out there that have got a lot of questions and are feeling very uncertain still, because we're still in a real state of flux overall. So actually, the more you can open up those opportunities to have open, honest conversations, the more supported people are going to feel overall.
Brilliant, thanks, Annie. And in terms of sort of English heritage, is that the approach that you take there, sort of dialogue and sort of information and supporting people to work it through? I don't know if you could say any more about the context at EH.
We're really lucky that we have now that we've been able to access things like Zoom, we've made really great use of it. And so one of the things that we were always really conscious of was that there's lots of our volunteer managers out there that might be doing this as part of a completely other job. It's just an add-on. There are other people who it's their full-time job. And so what we've made use of is Zoom to be able to open that conversation for people. So we have a regular open forum where volunteer managers can come and use that space for action learning sets and open conversations. That's something that we've implemented through the COVID pandemic, partly because we knew that a lot of volunteer managers felt very isolated when other people were on furlough. We've also got an online area where volunteer managers can discuss what they're facing, so have dialogue via sort of forums and chats as well. Now that's through something that we use, which is Fuse, which is an online learning platform, but there are loads of other types of software that can be used for free that are out there as well. The one thing that I would say is that we find though is that a lot of the people that access those things all of the time are the people that are already on board with the message and already feel supported and already feel comfortable. Our challenge right now as a team is to find how we reach out to those people who are never going to get the time away from the front desk to go and have those sorts of conversations, who feel very isolated, who don't really know why they're doing volunteer management, and who don't necessarily want to do volunteer management. So, and that's a challenge for us as an organisation as a whole, and it's something that we're working through, but we are seeing a lot of that start to come to fruition now as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Annie. And it's great to hear some of the practical things that you've done. And just for all the delegates out there who feel perhaps a few steps back on this journey, I'd just like to say, let's recognise that you've done a great leap forward by joining us today, because that's what conferences and facilities like this is all about as well, around you sort of linking up with others in the sector to share ideas, learn and sort of troubleshoot what you're going through. And obviously a huge plug then for the Heritage Volunteering Group. We have a monthly coffee afternoon where we do exactly this. So if you find yourself in a smaller organisation with less opportunity to have dialogue, do join us at HVG to do the same thing. Does anyone else have any further thoughts on that idea of supporting either staffing teams or volunteering teams through change, and any good tips that you have from your organisations?
I was just going to jump on with something you just said there, Rhiannon, about HVG, and just say absolutely. For me, I come from a local authority-run museum service. We're quite small compared to some of the other organisations out there. HVG has been a massive help in terms of having that conversation and being able to understand that you're not the only volunteer coordinator out there thinking, oh God, what do we do next? So I'd really, really invite everyone to get involved with that. And just to pick up on Annie's points about comms and consultation, 100%, that's definitely been how we've managed to get our teams through change, just that constant and open communication. And remembering that in light of what is an ever-changing pandemic situation, and we've just had an announcement this week that has probably thrown some people into fits of joy at the idea that we're nearly all over. Other people will be now panicking and not being sure what to do. So I think as leaders, we just have to recognise those different points people might be at and just be very conscious of that when we're communicating and talking about next steps.
Absolutely. And whilst we've been talking, Matt has kindly put the HVG Facebook link in for anyone who's not connected to us to absolutely loop up that way. Brilliant. Well, sort of on that sort of note of change and adjustment, I'm actually going to move on to a question around sort of diversity and equality, and sort of Annie and Ben and Rosie and Rob, mainly coming to Annie and Ben from an HVG EDI perspective, but please do chip in others. We've had a lot of questions about how we support our organisations looking to diversify their volunteering teams, and any top tips around that. We just had a great workshop from Tamsin, so we might rerun that again. But but also about how we support our existing teams to welcome those new faces joining us. There's been several sort of questions that allude to challenges where the old meets the new, and it being, you know, somewhat challenging and a bit sticky. So Ben, maybe coming to you first, see if you've got any thoughts with that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of about that. Sorry, I broke up slightly, Rhiannon, at the beginning there. So just that's a bit about buy-in, was it, at the beginning? Sorry, and getting people on board.
So any top tips for diversifying your volunteering team, and then how you sort of smooth bringing new faces into pre-existing teams?
Yeah. And again, just referencing something I think Tamsin was talking about in her session this morning, my first thought is always those small steps and looking at your immediate, I guess, sphere of influence, if you like. It can feel like, oh, I'll not be listened to, I can't make change, I can't actually influence anything, but that's not true at all. You do have influence over something. And when it comes to, of course, diversity and inclusion, that could be something as small as how you write your role profile and where that is advertised. So it's reaching different parts of our communities. In terms of getting, smoothing it over, I suppose, and trying to get that, then you do need that buy-in without question. And I always think about that buy-in in sort of three ways. So there is a legal obligation to do equality, diversity, inclusion under the Equality Act. There is a moral reason for doing it. We've talked about being on the right side of history, and most of our organisations will claim to be, to use phrases at the minute, liberal and woke. So if we're going to actually, if we're going to say that, we need to live it. So this is actually something we should be doing because we say we're going to be doing it. And then finally, the last one, I think, which can help get buy-in and get trustees on board and get other people on board, is economic. So there is a lot of money in being a diverse organisation. So if we took, for example, the Purple Pound, which is the considered how much people, the spending power of people who identify as disabled and their households, that is currently estimated at 274 billion a year. That can trickle down into tourism and heritage quite easily. So yeah, I would say legal, moral and economic are the ways to get that top-down buy-in that then kind of forces some of that happening and can get you the training that you need and get you that kind of helping to smooth over some of those issues you might encounter. I'm not sure if Annie's got any other thoughts on that.
I think I'd add a fourth one in, Ben, which is the value that those volunteers are going to bring in terms of their knowledge and experience, and the different perspectives that people will bring when you approach new audiences as well. I think what's really critical is that there's so much information out there about how we can approach new audiences, and we talk a lot about it and we say that we need help with it, but actually there's loads of information out there. And I think that I would always start from a place of, well, which audience is it that I'm trying to work with? Which audience is it that I want to attract more? Who are my local audiences? Doing something as simple as just mapping where your volunteers come from and which areas around you that they come from, so that you can start to tap into those different communities, is a really easy starting point that you can use Google for, and actually something that not a lot of us do. You can go further and look at mosaic data and all of those sorts of things, but I think starting with the simple small things, like Ben said, looking at how you use language, is your language accessible, is a really good starting point. And then again, starting to have those conversations about why it is that people aren't coming to you in the first place. If you want to reach into an audience, you need to understand why it is that they're not coming to you as well, and I think that's really vital. But in terms of that, bringing new people in when you've got existing volunteers, you're always going to have that challenge no matter what. That's always going to be the case. You're going to have the, well, I've been here for 10 years, 9-year person, so actually on your bike. That's going to be the case. That's human nature. We're quite tribal in that respect, and actually that's the identifier, is how we're different. But starting to break down those barriers with social stuff, with training, with buddying, making people buddies is a really effective way of helping them to take that responsibility for bringing a new person in a really positive way, that pays dividends. They're some of the practical things that I would recommend.
Absolutely, and just picking up, I'll come to you. It's something I found actually in ZSL, that with a huge recruitment in the pandemic, but less opportunity for groups to mix, there is a bit of a two-camp issue we've got, but actually we are looking to address that in exactly the same way that you've described. And I think with the restrictions hopefully on the way out, or at least easing to the lowest possible level, that will be much easier. So for us, it's sort of social opportunities, ways for different people to mix and cut across the team. Absolutely. Rosie?
Yeah, I just sort of wanted to add, it's a bit of a reflection on, I guess, focusing first though on existing volunteers and ensuring that there is a good experience of re-engagement with volunteers, and that everybody feels comfortable and kind of reorientated in this slightly odd landscape and new priorities and flexibility and such like. So for our volunteers, bringing them back is involving them in discussions in terms of the health and safety, and what does that look like for you, and how will things change, and helping them shape that, and then involving them in new recruitment for new volunteers. So Annie, you talked about buddying and such like, so we want to involve existing volunteers in taster sessions and that sort of thing for new volunteers, but we're not even going to think about recruitment until we know that our existing volunteers are comfortable and that there's no issues there, or else you kind of have that ripple effect. So yeah.
Great points, Rosie. And coming to you, Rob.
Yeah, just a couple of quick thoughts. I first of all endorse everything that everybody said already, and I think the point, I think it was Annie made it about, there's already loads of resources out there. I mean, there's 25 years worth at least of resources out there on doing a lot of this stuff. So the question as to why it's not been done is not a lack of resources, it's probably a lack of will, and that lack of will may be from volunteer managers, but it may actually be from others in the organisation. So I think there's an opportunity to capitalise on some of the changes that we're making anyway as a result of the pandemic. So one of the things that I've talked a lot about is people's experience of volunteering over the last year has not been typical of what they've experienced previously. So it's been a lot fewer checks, a lot fewer application forms, all of those kinds of things. And rather than just kind of defaulting back to all of that when the pandemic eases, do we need to bring all of those kinds of things in? Can if we remove application forms from the process, or at least streamline them, how does that help us with the way that we go about thinking about EDI issues? Embracing more informal forms of volunteering. So I've been on record in the past about saying, when organisations talk about underrepresented groups in volunteering, it's about making those groups fit what we want, not changing what we do to fit what they're interested in. So all of those kind of debates are happening at the moment. And on the how do you work with your existing volunteers to balance that, if people haven't seen it, and I'll put the link in the chat, really go and have a look at the work that Helen Timbrell did, What the Bloody Hell Are You Doing Here, which was particularly around racial equality and organisations needing to adapt to volunteers from different racial and ethnic backgrounds coming into volunteering. And there was a piece that they did, she did, for the Association of Volunteer Managers, which is freely available. So I'll put that in the chat as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. And Ben, just last word on this question. Do you want to briefly mention the link you've popped and what good stuff that holds for people?
Yeah, so as part of the HVG EDI working group, we've been pulling together lots of different resources and putting them into a kind of collective brain, we kind of refer to it as, which is a Trello board, which I'll just pop the link in. It's freely accessible. You'll find things on there, websites, podcasts, resources, networks, things that kind of members of HVG have signposted us to, covering a whole range across the protected characteristics and beyond. So I just wanted to signpost people to that, to have a look at that. And also just to say that we will be looking at launching a buddying scheme in the coming months for HVG members to help people support one another one-to-one when it comes to equality, diversity and inclusion. So look out for that.
Brilliant, thank you, Ben. That's a great point to end that question on. many more links going in the chat, so please make sure you do have a look at it. And we talked a lot about sort of change and the fact that it's out there. I just want to come briefly to you, Rob, to see, do you think actually the sector is receptive to experimenting and trying volunteering in different ways? We talk about it, but you know, really, do you think we're receptive?
I think the sector, the voluntary sector, the heritage sector is receptive to change because we've all had to be receptive to change. I think whether the will is there around volunteering after the pandemic, a lot of the narrative that I hear from people outside of our volunteer management bubble is how can we get things back to normal as quickly as possible, get volunteers back to doing the things that they used to do, rather than thinking about the new ways that volunteers could support organisations and the new approaches. And I think, you know, volunteering's missing from a lot of these Build Back Better debates. I had a bit of an engagement on Twitter the other week with RNID when they announced that they were going completely remote and home-based and getting rid of all of their offices, and had they ever even thought about what the implications of that for volunteers were in that discussion. So I think there's probably an openness, but with the best will in the world, I think once you get to a level of seniority in many of our organisations, whether that's paid seniority in execs and leadership teams or board levels, the thought of volunteering probably doesn't occur to them unless somebody pokes them. And that may be particularly true in the concerns that they have about their financial future. So I think it's incumbent upon us to be the ones that need to go poking people to make sure that volunteering doesn't get forgotten.
And that's a brilliant sort of lead on to my sub question, which is, have any of you got any top tips for how we can advocate upwards within our organisation? Rob's got an entire book that relates to this, but any top tips on advocating for change and the positive change that we want to see within our organisations? Rosie, I'll come to you if you've got any tips for people.
Well, I think it's really ensuring there's a responsibility of ensuring that your volunteering program's represented in all your organisational plans. You know, it's a bit of a dry comment to make, but I think that it is important up into the KPIs. What are the success measures and who's accountable for those? You know, in Scotland, we have Heritage for All is the Historic Environment Scotland corporate plan, and then we have a strategy called Our Place and Time, and Our Place and Time is for the sector, by the sector, and it has its own volunteer working group, and that is because of a group of us who are volunteer managers advocated for that working group to have volunteering as a standalone topic. That has then created the Make Your Mark volunteer participation campaign that has EDI at the heart of it, and that now has a growing membership, and we're now working with HVG. And all of that came from volunteer managers originally coming together in a network was then HFOS, that I know a lot of you have worked with and is now part of linked with Make Your Mark and such like, but it came from that grassroots voice of volunteer organisers. So my tip there is, don't be shy of the fact that you might not be a senior leader in an organisation, of talking about it and in trying to ensure that it is in the plans. And if it doesn't make it into the plans, then question those and be a voice in why not. So yeah, it is a bit of an obvious thing, but I think it is quite amazing how many plans and work plans and such like you do read, and volunteering doesn't even get a comment in there, and people talk about, you know, like their people directorates and such like, and sometimes volunteering just doesn't get a mention, and that needs to be challenged and questioned.
Excellent, thanks Rosie. Any tips, Annie or Ben, about how to have those conversations, maybe get yourself in front of those people?
I was just going to say, other than Rob's blogs, which are also excellent, I was just going to say, actually be brave about it. We all, as volunteer coordinators and managers, have case studies, stories, pictures, videos, quotes, volunteers that will happily talk to anyone and everyone. Put those things under the nose of senior managers. You work within that organisation. There is nothing stopping or wrong with you saying, this is a good thing that's happened in our organisation, look at it. And that's kind of what I've been doing, you know, and I think, yeah, be brave and confident in the amazing stuff that your volunteers are doing, to put that forward in whatever format you can.
Brilliant. Great. Okay.
I was just going to add, Rhiannon, that I think understanding how the governance of your organisation works is a really important part of all of this, because if you don't understand how the governance of your organisation works, you are never going to get to have those conversations. And I come across repeatedly people who don't understand how the governance of their organisation works, whether it be a local authority, whether it be a charity. And I think that's really critical, because without that, you're not going to understand who the right people are to have the right conversations with. And there are lots of people out there in your organisations who will be a very good advocate, are gatekeepers, and who are open to these conversations. So start to learn how your organisation works and who your key gatekeepers are, and the language that they want to hear things in are the three things that I would always recommend, things to start to think about as well.
Great tips. Annie, last words, Rob, on that one?
Very quickly, and I've been banging on about it for years, so apology if people have heard me say this before. Buddy up with another leader of volunteer engagement, either in your community or in your area, and join each other's boards. And you join each other's boards as an advocate for volunteering, and then you're actually in that decision-making position. I think one of the things that we can do as volunteer managers is volunteer at a strategic level in order to be able to have that voice and affect change directly within organisations. So volunteer to be on somebody else's board, and make sure you encourage that board to make good decisions about volunteering.
Absolutely. And Ben has popped a note in there about finding your allies. Absolutely, both within your organisation and outside. I have to say, I draw on colleagues in other organisations all the time to boost me. So we're going to draw to a close. I'm going to ask one final question from all the panellists, and I'm going to ask them to try and project into the future, if I may. So can you describe what you think volunteering might look like in the future, 5-10 years down the line? Quite a hard question, but this came up quite a lot, so we'd just like to know the nuggets from you. And if there's anything that you'd like to say around sort of virtual versus in person, that would also be really interesting to reflect on, because there's been a lot coming up about that as well. So we'll get to Rosie first.
I think that there will be a lot more micro volunteering. I think from our devices, you know, we'll be contributing to the things we love and that we're passionate about on the bus somewhere, you know, just dropping into the little app that we love to do some mapping somewhere in another part of the world about some sort of animal that we love or something. I think that we can't move back from where we've gone with the digital landscape, and nor should we do that. So I think definitely digital. And I do believe, I'm ever the optimist, but I do believe that this shift in terms of the need for equity and support and EDI, so I think in volunteering will be more reflective and will be more flexible and reflective of communities, as long as we all pick up on all the points we've been talking about the voices and the cohesion and working together. So it is an optimistic look from me.
Great. Rob.
Okay, I'm going to be pessimistic and I'm going to be optimistic. The pessimistic bit is I've been working in this sector for 27 years, and in many ways we're still dealing with the same issues that we were dealing with 27 years ago. So the pessimist in me says that in 10 years' time, I don't really think much is going to have changed. I think volunteers are still going to be vital to society. But I don't think a lot of what we're kind of maybe thinking about in this conversation may have changed much. The optimist side of me, and I think it's the bit that I hope comes out of this pandemic more than anything else, is that for 3 months last year in that first lockdown, we stopped being an economy and we became a society, and everybody looked out for everybody else, and everybody stood outside their doors, whether you liked it or not, on a Thursday evening, and clapped in part for the work that volunteers did, as well as lots of other incredibly important people in our society. And for those 3 months, volunteering was something that everybody got, understood, celebrated, recognised, and it's kind of slipped back into the shadows until the vaccination programme came along. And then I think it's kind of gained prominence again. So I really hope that in 10 years' time, there will be a much greater public awareness of pride in volunteering than we have now, that it won't be an embarrassment to say that we're a volunteer, but it's something that we're willing to shout from the metaphorical rooftops.
Hear, hear. And briefly, Ben, and then Annie.
I would just reflect on Rosie and Rob and completely agree and hope that is the case. And I would think with the momentum we've seen in COVID coming out of things like Black Lives Matter and that real awareness raising around the inequalities in our society and trying to change those, that in 10 years' time we will be seeing volunteering in every organisation that is genuinely accessible to everyone.
Perfect. Annie?
I agree with all of the above. But I also think that one of the things that has become apparent over the last few years and will continue is that volunteer management being a profession. And I think that the more we see that and the more we talk about that and the more we drive that as a community, the more that volunteering as a whole will become vital, even more vital and more seen and more visible and more understood. That would be my hope for the future.
Wonderful. Well, a huge thank you to our 4 panelists. It's been an absolutely fantastic panel discussion and we could have gone on for hours longer. We will actually be picking up on this idea of reimagining in the next HVG coffee afternoon, which is the 2nd Tuesday in August. So we will carry on with this forward thinking ideas, but I feel really roused now to go and do my very best to try and make sure that vision, the positive one at least, is where we are headed to. So thank you all.